There was once a boy named Eli, but he didn't arrive in this world shattered. He came into life wide-eyed, curious, soft. And as his story unfolds, don't be surprised if a part of you quietly stirs with it. By the end of this video, something you thought you had buried may finally reveal itself. The kind of child who studies light on the wall as if it's a message. A boy who asked questions not to annoy but to understand. A boy who dreamed in shapes and sounds before he ever learned disappointment. But the house he grew up in, that house was allergic to softness. His father walked in every night like a storm with no warning, slamming doors, spitting anger, filling the rooms with a tension that clung to the ceiling. His mother mastered the art of disappearing while standing right in front of him. She hid behind dishes, laundry, migraines, anything that kept her from naming what was happening. Eli learned survival in the quietest ways, memorizing which floorboards betrayed footsteps, which breaths triggered arguments, which expressions meant danger. He became fluent in silence long before he learned to speak. And still, what cracked him wasn't just the chaos, it was the pretending. The family photos, the polite greetings, the everything is fine, that everyone repeated like a prayer they didn't believe. The performance of normality was the knife. The denial was the infection. Because the human mind can endure pain, but it collapses under the weight of a reality no one else will acknowledge. Trauma doesn't stay in the memory like an old story. It melts into the bones. It wraps itself around the nervous system. It slowly distorts the way a child interprets people, safety, love, and most painfully themselves. It teaches them, you are not safe. You are not seen. You do not matter. So Eli grew, but the fear grew with him. He built a mask that fit like a second skin. Charming, quick, adaptable. He could read a room in seconds, morph into whatever version of himself made others comfortable. People called it charisma. He never corrected them. He knew it was camouflage. But inside, he was a burned-out house. The frame still upright, rooms hollow, windows blackened. The kind of emptiness no one notices until they step inside. That is the cost of unprocessed trauma. It fractures the self into pieces that never learned how to live together. Jung once wrote that the deepest wounds in a family are the unlived lives of the parents. Eli didn't just inherit their genes. He inherited their silence, their shame, their emotional drought. A legacy passed down not through DNA, but through everything that was never said. His unraveling didn't arrive like a thunderbolt. It seeped in. First sleepless nights, then the constant sense that something was off, even when life looked stable from the outside. After that came the rage, the distrust, the self-loathing that gnawed at him like an animal. Relationships, they became minefields. Anyone who came close felt both his pull and his push. The desperation for connection and the terror of it. He sabotaged the very love he begged for. He went to therapy once, told the therapist he felt numb, that his dreams were fragmented, that some mornings he stared at his own reflection and felt like he was watching a stranger breathe. They gave him labels. But labels are bandages that never touch the wound underneath. Because when trauma is buried, it doesn't die. It burrows, it waits. It shapes the entire architecture of a life until it finally spills out as addiction, collapse, rage, or the sudden silence of someone who once laughed too loudly. Eventually, Eli began answering himself, not out of boredom, out of fracture. The conversations in his mind grew sharper, darker, louder. Arguments with ghosts of moments he never survived. He started passing mirrors without even acknowledging them. There was no flinch, no hesitation, just a man who no longer expected to recognize the face looking back. He kept a small notebook in his pocket too, filling it with fragmented sentences and half-formed thoughts that no one else could decipher. His friends insisted he had changed, but the truth was far more tragic. Eli wasn't becoming someone new. He was simply too exhausted to keep pretending. That's the part no one talks about when they imagine losing your mind. It's rarely chaos at first. It's fatigue. It's the soul finally dropping the mask it has been forced to hold up for decades. A person can swallow their wounds only for so long, bury their fear, silence their pain, deny their memories, Eventually, the psyche doesn't explode. It cracks, because the mind isn't a steel machine. It's a delicate weaving of beliefs, emotions, childhood imprints, and meaning. And when too many threads are soaked in unspoken suffering, that weaving begins to rip apart. Eli's reality shifted quietly. He began to trust the voices that once scared him, started interpreting everyday objects as coded messages meant only for him. He named it pattern recognition, convinced the universe had chosen him as its interpreter. Not metaphorically, literally. A stranger's glance, a flickering streetlight, a random commercial, everything became a signal. But the truth was painfully simple. His mind, starved for structure after years of inner chaos, was inventing order where none existed. It was trying to create meaning out of unresolved hurt. That's the vicious nature of unhealed trauma. It doesn't stay in the past. It mutates. It wears different masks. Anxiety one day, anger the next, and sometimes a sense of mystical clarity that feels like revelation but is actually desperation. Under every symptom, every breakdown, every outburst, there's always the same child whispering through the cracks, "Please see me, please save me, please help me." But by the time that whisper reaches the surface, the world has already stepped back in fear. Society doesn't know how to understand these fractures. It sensationalizes them, judges them, turns them into cautionary tales. And Eli, like countless others, was reduced to another sad headline, another what happened, another statistic people discuss without understanding. He didn't unravel because he was fragile. He unraveled because he had been strong long past his limit. Some people label it madness, but Kyung, studying the depths of the human psyche, called it something else, individuation. The brutal, necessary confrontation with the shadowed parts of the self, the journey toward wholeness through darkness. But for someone like Eli, this process didn't feel like transformation. It felt like drowning, being dragged into ancient waters where nothing speaks in language, only in symbols, echoes, and the old screams trapped behind childhood doors. Because here's the truth, you don't just lose your mind one afternoon. It starts as a tiny fracture, almost invisible, spreading quietly over the years like a hairline crack in a mirror. From the outside, people will say he snapped. What they didn't witness were the 1,000 breaks that came long before the collapse. It wasn't the loud moments that broke him, it was the quiet ones. The nights where the house felt hollow, the pauses no one noticed, the spaces where a child should have been held but wasn't. People think burying the past means escaping it, but when you bury pain, you don't bury it alive. You bury it growing. Unhealed trauma doesn't fade, it becomes a presence, a haunting, not a memory, but a companion that follows you through adulthood, whispering old truths you tried to forget. Eli wasn't only wrestling with what happened to him, he was carrying years of abandonment, confusion, shame, and grief that never had a name. Every moment he stayed silent as a child came back to him with a roar as an adult. This is where the boundary between sane and insane dissolves. In psychology, we describe something called the false self, the version of you that emerges not to live, not to love, but simply to survive. That self learns to smile on command, perform stability, hide wounds even from itself, but the truth you bury never forgets you. One day the mask loses its strength, it cracks, and beneath it stands your shadow. The anger you denied, the grief you minimized, the ache you convinced yourself didn't matter. This is what people mistakenly call madness, but madness, real madness, is the soul refusing to continue the lie. It's the mind's uprising, the psyche's final protest after being silenced for too long. And buried inside that collapse is an opportunity. Because when everything falls apart, when the lies finally break, what remains is the one thing that can save you: the truth. Eli's truth was brutal. He was abused, he was ignored, he was unseen, and he spent years convincing himself none of it mattered. But it did. It always did. Carl Jung believed that healing begins the moment the unconscious is brought into the light, that facing your darkness is the doorway to redemption. But facing the past means feeling what you've spent a lifetime avoiding. And beneath the numbness, beneath the confusion, beneath the apparent madness, lies something far more terrifying: vulnerability. To walk into your own shadow, you have to soften again. You have to grieve, and grief is its own kind of death. Eli began to write, not for clarity, not even for healing, but because the pain needed somewhere to go. His pages were chaotic: sketches, erratic lines, repeated sentences. One sentence appeared again and again, sometimes 50 times in a row. "I didn't deserve this." That sentence didn't give him peace, but it gave him permission. Permission to finally feel anger. Permission to finally feel sadness. Permission to feel anything. And in that rawness, he touched something he hadn't felt in years: hope. Healing doesn't start with motivation or optimism. It starts with honesty, and honesty is born in pain. When Eli returned to therapy, he didn't perform anymore. He didn't pretend to be insightful or enlightened. He simply cried. For the child who had no protection, for the adult who never felt safe, for the madness that suddenly made sense when he stopped running from it. He wasn't cured, but he was no longer lost. He learned something essential. Madness was never the enemy. It was the message, a cry from the parts of himself that had been locked away for decades. And when he finally opened the door, those parts didn't attack him. They embraced him because for the first time he was listening. If you've ever felt like you're unraveling, if the world feels too sharp and you feel too fragile, remember this: you are not broken, you are buried, and healing isn't about becoming someone new. It's about remembering who you were before pain convinced you to forget yourself. If something in this story touched a place in you that you usually keep locked, then do this. Choose one word that represents where you are right now and leave it in the comments. Not an explanation, not a confession, just a word. A word becomes a doorway, and sometimes opening a doorway is the first act of coming back to yourself. Where do you begin? Start with silence. Not the dead silence of dissociation, but the sacred kind where you meet yourself again. Write, scream, walk, cry. But do it with awareness. Do it without shame. And above all, don't heal for perfection. Heal to be real. Heal so you can finally look into a mirror and recognize the person staring back. Because the world doesn't need more masks. It needs people who have walked through their own darkness and returned carrying light. And if any part of Eli's story felt a little too familiar, if something inside you whispered, "This might be me," then hear this. You don't have to walk into your shadow alone. Here we face the things most people avoid. We name what was never named. We heal in honesty, not perfection. So if you're ready to understand yourself a little deeper, if you want to keep exploring the parts of you that were buried, stay here. Join us, subscribe, and let's keep walking this path together. Because your story isn't over, it's just finally being heard.